What you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about trust, motherhood, and the people closest to you. This is the security footage from Seattle General Hospital, October 15th, 11:47 p.m. A woman collapses in the maternity ward while another woman stands watching. But here's what will shock you. The woman watching isn't a stranger. She's the business partner who's been sleeping with the dying woman's husband. And she's smiling. Sarah Richardson thought she had it all figured out. A billionaire husband, twin babies on the way, and a future that seemed golden. But while she was fighting for her life in that hospital bed, someone else was systematically stealing everything she loved. Her husband, her children, even her sanity. You think you know where this story's going? You think this is just another affair gone wrong. But what Sarah discovered in those final moments will make your blood run cold. Because the woman who destroyed her family wasn't just a mistress. She was something far more dangerous. Something that had done this before. The DNA test results that saved Sarah's children revealed a truth so twisted, so calculated, that it made headlines across the country. And it started with one simple question that every parent should ask. Who do you really trust with your children's lives? This is a story about a mother's love that reached beyond death itself, about evil hiding behind a helpful smile, and about why you should never, ever ignore that voice in your head that whispers, something isn't right. Stay with me for the next hour, because by the time this story ends, you'll understand why Sarah Richardson's fight became a battle that every parent needs to hear. And if this story makes you think twice about the people in your own life, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this warning. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because stories like this one could save lives, including yours. Now let me tell you how it really began. In the sterile glow of Seattle General Hospital's security monitor, a woman collapsed in the maternity ward corridor while another stood watching, her lips curved in what could only be described as satisfaction. This moment, captured at 11:47 p.m. on October 15, would later become evidence in one of the most shocking betrayal cases the Pacific Northwest had ever witnessed. But our story begins 6 months earlier, in the glass towers of downtown Seattle, where Sarah Mitchell thought she had everything figured out. Sarah had always been the type of person who planned for everything. As a former emergency room nurse, she understood that life could change in an instant, but she also believed that careful preparation could protect the people you loved. At 28, she had traded her scrubs for the quiet luxury of being the wife of James Richardson, the 35-year-old tech billionaire whose company, Richardson Industries, was about to go public. The morning Sarah discovered she was pregnant with twins, she was organizing James's home office while he traveled to San Francisco for investor meetings. The pregnancy test results lay on his mahogany desk like a small miracle. After 3 years of fertility treatments and devastating losses, her doctor had called it nearly impossible. Yet here was the ultrasound image showing 2 tiny heartbeats. She called James immediately, her hands shaking as she held the phone. "Twins," she whispered when he answered. "James, we're having twins." The silence stretched so long, she wondered if the call had dropped. "That's incredible, Sarah," he finally said, but his voice carried a strange distance. "Listen, I'm in the middle of something with Cassie and the investors. Can we talk about this tonight?" Cassie. Cassandra Wells had been James's business partner since their Stanford days and now served as chief marketing officer of Richardson Industries. Sarah had met her exactly 3 times in 2 years of marriage, each encounter leaving her with an inexplicable sense of unease. "Of course," Sarah said, swallowing her disappointment. "I love you." "Love you too," he replied, already distracted. That evening, James returned home with champagne and apologies. He swept Sarah into his arms, spinning her around their minimalist living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. "I'm sorry I was rushed today," he said, his blue eyes bright with what seemed like genuine excitement. "This is amazing news. The timing is actually perfect with the IPO launch." Sarah wanted to ask what the IPO had to do with their babies, but James was already talking about nursery designs and the best private schools in Seattle. She pushed down her questions and let herself be carried away by his enthusiasm. The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks later. Sarah was unpacking groceries when she found a small gold earring caught in the couch cushions. It was delicate, expensive, with a distinctive pearl drop that she had never seen before. She held it up to the light. studying the craftsmanship. When James came home, she showed him the earring. "Any idea where this came from?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. James barely glanced at it. "Probably fell out of one of the bags from your shopping trip. You know how those department stores are with their samples." But Sarah hadn't been shopping. She had been on bed rest for the past week due to early pregnancy complications. "James, I haven't left the house in days." His expression shifted, becoming almost defensive. "Sarah, you're being paranoid. Maybe the cleaning lady dropped it. Maybe it was there from the previous owners. Does it really matter?" The word paranoid hit her like a physical blow. In all their time together, James had never dismissed her concerns so curtly. "I guess not," she said quietly, slipping the earring into her pocket. That night, as James slept beside her, Sarah lay awake thinking about the earring and about Cassie Wells, whose image she had seen in countless business magazines alongside James. She thought about the way Cassie had looked at her during their brief meetings, with eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emma in Portland. "How are you feeling? Any morning sickness?" As Sarah typed her response, she heard James's phone vibrate on his nightstand. In the blue glow of the screen, she could see a message preview. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. The presentation will be perfect. Ioani." It was 1 in the morning. Sarah's heart began to race, but she forced herself to stay still. There could be a dozen innocent explanations. Cassie was a workaholic. Time zones were confusing when you traveled constantly. Business partnerships required constant communication. But deep in her chest, a cold certainty began to form. Something was very, very wrong. The next morning, James surprised Sarah with breakfast in bed and an announcement that made her forget all about midnight text messages. "I've cleared my schedule for the rest of the week," he said, setting down a tray with fresh strawberries and cream. "I think we should take a baby moon before things get too crazy with the twins." Sarah's face lit up. "Really? But what about the IPO preparations?" "Cassie can handle the investor meetings. She's been pushing for more responsibility anyway." James sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting gently on Sarah's still small bump. "This is more important. You're more important." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense, it brought tears to her eyes. This was the James she had fallen in love with, the man who had once driven 4 hours to surprise her during a difficult shift at the hospital. The one who remembered that she liked exactly 2 sugars in her coffee and always bought the organic strawberries because the regular ones made her feel guilty. They spent 3 perfect days at a boutique resort on Whidbey Island. James turned off his phone except for emergencies and devoted himself entirely to Sarah. They walked on the beach, planned nursery themes, and talked about names. Sarah felt the cold knot of suspicion in her chest begin to dissolve. On their last evening, as they watched the sunset from their private deck, James pulled out a small velvet box. "I know we're already married," he said, "but I wanted to give you something to commemorate this moment, our family beginning." Inside was a delicate necklace with 2 intertwined hearts, each containing a tiny diamond. "One for each baby," he explained, fastening it around her neck. Sarah was crying now, overwhelmed by love and relief. "I'm sorry I've been so emotional lately. The pregnancy hormones are making me crazy." "You haven't been crazy," James said firmly. "You've been perfect." That night they made love with a tenderness that reminded Sarah why she had married him. As she drifted off to sleep in his arms, she felt more secure than she had in months. The feeling lasted exactly 18 hours. Sarah woke up at 3 a.m. with cramping that sent ice through her veins. At 24 weeks pregnant, any pain was cause for concern. She shook James awake, trying not to panic. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "We need to go to the hospital." The emergency room at Seattle General was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Sarah's blood pressure was dangerously high, and the twins' heart rates were showing signs of distress. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, spoke in the calm but serious tone Sarah recognized from her own nursing days. "We're seeing early signs of preeclampsia," he explained. "At this stage, we need to monitor you very closely. I'm admitting you for observation." As Sarah was wheeled to the maternity ward, James walking beside her gurney, she saw a familiar figure standing near the nurse's station. Cassie Wells, dressed in an elegant gray suit despite the early hour, was speaking quietly with one of the doctors. Cassie? Sarah called out weakly. What are you doing here? Cassie turned, her expression instantly morphing into one of concern. Oh, Sarah, thank God you're okay. James called me when you were in the ambulance. I came as soon as I could. Sarah looked at James in confusion. You called her? She was my emergency contact for business issues, James explained quickly. When I grabbed my phone to call the hospital, I accidentally hit her number instead of my assistant's. She insisted on coming. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about Cassie's presence felt wrong. The woman looked too composed, too prepared, as if she had been expecting this crisis. I should let you rest, Cassie said, moving closer to the bed. But I wanted you to know that everything at the office is handled. James doesn't need to worry about anything except taking care of you and the babies. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on Sarah's arm, and Sarah noticed that Cassie was wearing the match to the earrings she had found in her couch. Thank you, Sarah managed to say, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. As Cassie left, promising to check in soon, Sarah caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. In the brief moment when Cassie hugged James goodbye, Sarah saw the woman's expression change. The mask of concern slipped, revealing something that looked almost like triumph. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to convince herself she was seeing things. The pregnancy, the medication, the stress, they were all making her paranoid. But when she opened her eyes again, Cassie was still watching her through the doorway, and she was definitely smiling. 3 days into Sarah's hospital stay, the routine had become almost comfortable. James arrived every morning with coffee for himself and herbal tea for Sarah. He worked from the chair beside her bed, taking calls and reviewing documents while she dozed or read pregnancy books. The monitors showed the twins were stable, and Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic about managing the preeclampsia until they reached a safer gestational age. Then Cassie started visiting. It began innocuously enough. She brought flowers and magazines, claiming she was in the hospital anyway, for a board meeting with the hospital's CEO about a potential partnership with Richardson Industries. She asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's condition and admired the ultrasound photos taped to the wall. But Sarah began to notice things. Small things that individually meant nothing but together formed a disturbing pattern. Cassie knew which nurse was assigned to Sarah's care before Sarah herself did. She had opinions about Sarah's medications that seemed unusually informed for someone with no medical background. Most unsettling of all, she had begun referring to the twins in a possessive way that made Sarah's skin crawl. "How are our little ones doing today?" Cassie would ask, her hand hovering over Sarah's belly, as if she had the right to touch. "They're not your babies," Sarah wanted to scream, but the words never came. Instead, she would smile weakly and make some non-committal response about feeling fine. On Thursday evening, Sarah's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. Her blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels and the twins showed signs of distress. "Oh, Doctor, Martinez made the decision that Sarah had been dreading. We need to deliver tonight," he told her and James. "At 28 weeks, they have a good chance. But every hour we wait increases the risk to all three of you." James went pale. "Are you sure there's no other option?" "I'm afraid not. We'll do everything we can, but you need to prepare yourselves for a difficult fight ahead." As the medical team prepared for an emergency cesarean section, Sarah felt a strange calm descend over her. She had delivered enough premature babies during her nursing career to know the statistics, the challenges, the long road ahead. But she also knew that babies born at 28 weeks could thrive with proper care. "They're going to be okay," she told James, squeezing his hand as they wheeled her toward the operating room. "They're fighters." The surgery itself was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, but she heard the most beautiful sounds in the world. Two thin, angry cries announcing her children's arrival. "Twin A is a boy, 4 pounds 2 ounces, she heard someone announce. "Twin B is a girl, 3 pounds 14 ounces. Both babies are breathing on their own." Oliver and Emma, Sarah thought through the haze of medication. She had chosen the names months ago, but hadn't told anyone, wanting to keep something precious for herself. When Sarah woke up in recovery 6 hours later, James was sitting beside her bed, his eyes red with exhaustion and emotion. "They're beautiful," he whispered. "So small, but the doctors say they're strong. They're in the NICU, but you can see them as soon as you're stable enough to be moved. Sarah tried to sit up, desperate to see her children, but waves of dizziness forced her back down. Soon, James promised. Dr. Martinez said probably this afternoon. Have you held them? Sarah asked. James nodded, tears in his eyes. Oliver grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go. And Emma, she has your nose. For a moment, the joy overwhelmed everything else. They had done it. Despite all the complications and fears, their babies were here and alive. Then Cassie walked into the recovery room. I hope you don't mind, she said softly. James asked me to come. He thought you might want to know that I've taken care of everything at the office. You two don't need to worry about anything except your family. Sarah blinked slowly, struggling to process through the fog of painkillers. That's thoughtful of you. I also took the liberty of calling your sister Emma to let her know about the babies. She's driving up from Portland and should be here this evening. Something about that felt wrong, but Sarah couldn't put her finger on what. Through the haze, she heard Cassie continue talking. The NICU staff is absolutely wonderful. I spent some time with Oliver and Emma while you were sleeping. They're such perfect little angels. Sarah's eyes snapped open. You've seen my babies. James thought it would be helpful to have an extra pair of eyes while he was with you, Cassie explained smoothly. I wanted to make sure they were getting the best possible care. Sarah looked at James, who suddenly seemed unable to meet her eyes. You let her see them before me? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. Sarah, you were unconscious, James said quickly. Someone needed to be there, and Cassie volunteered. I thought you'd want someone you trusted to check on them. But Sarah didn't trust Cassie. She never had, and she certainly didn't now. The woman had inserted herself into the most intimate moment of Sarah's life, had seen her children before their own mother could. I want to see them now, Sarah said, struggling to sit up despite the pain. The doctor said you need to rest a few more hours, Cassie said gently. The babies are sleeping anyway. I promise they're in excellent hands. Sarah looked from Cassie to James and saw something that made her heart sink. They were united in their concern for her, presenting a solid front of gentle authority that completely excluded her from decisions about her own children. This was only the beginning. By Friday morning, Sarah was strong enough to be wheeled to the NICU. Her first sight of Oliver and Emma took her breath away. They were impossibly tiny, their bodies dwarfed by the incubators that surrounded them with warmth and life-sustaining equipment. But they were perfect, and they were hers. Sarah spent the entire day beside their incubators, talking softly to them and learning their personalities. Oliver was restless, constantly moving his small hands and feet. Emma was quieter but more alert, her dark eyes seeming to track Sarah's voice. For the first time since her hospitalization began, Sarah felt completely at peace. That peace lasted until James returned from a quick trip home to shower and change clothes. How are they doing? He asked, settling into the chair beside Sarah's wheelchair. Perfect, Sarah said simply. Dr. Kim says they're ahead of the curve for 28-weekers. Their breathing is strong, and they're already trying to suck. James smiled, but Sarah noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. That's wonderful news. Is everything okay? You seem distracted. James hesitated, then pulled out his phone. I got a call from Dr. Martinez while I was at home. He wants to discuss your recovery timeline. What about it? Apparently your blood pressure is still unstable. He's concerned about postpartum complications. Sarah frowned. My blood pressure was fine this morning. The nurse said it was the best reading they'd had since I was admitted. That's not what Dr. Martinez told me, James said quietly. He said there might be some memory issues from the medication. It's not uncommon with severe preeclampsia. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Memory issues? James, I feel fine. I remember everything clearly. I know you do, sweetheart, but the doctor is concerned that you might not be accurately assessing your own condition. Before Sarah could respond, Cassie appeared in the NICU doorway. She had been visiting daily, always with some thoughtful gift or helpful gesture that Sarah couldn't object to without seeming ungrateful. I hope I'm not interrupting, Cassie said softly. I brought some lactation supplies that I thought might be helpful. Sarah watched as Cassie produced an expensive breast pump and collection kit. That's very thoughtful, but the hospital provides equipment. Oh, this is much better quality. Cassie assured her. I did quite a bit of research on premature infant nutrition. The pump you use can make a significant difference in milk production and quality. Sarah felt a familiar unease at how much Cassie seemed to know about her specific situation. Thank you, but I think I'm fine with what the hospital recommends. Of course, Cassie said smoothly. I just want to help however I can. These little ones are going to need every advantage. As if summoned by her voice, Dr. Martinez appeared at Sarah's wheelchair. Mrs. Richardson, I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to discuss your discharge timeline. When can I go home? Sarah asked eagerly. I want to be able to visit the babies without having to coordinate with the nursing staff. Dr. Martinez exchanged a glance with James that didn't escape Sarah's notice. I'm afraid we need to extend your stay for observation. Your blood pressure readings have been inconsistent, and we're seeing some concerning patterns in your lab work. What kind of patterns? Sarah demanded. I feel fine, better than I have in weeks. Sometimes patients with severe preeclampsia experience a false sense of recovery, Dr. Martinez explained patiently. Your body has been through significant trauma. We need to be very careful about monitoring for complications. Sarah looked around the group of concerned faces and felt a creeping sense of isolation. I want to see my lab results. Of course, Dr. Martinez said. I'll have them sent to your room this afternoon. But when Sarah returned to her room, there were no lab results waiting. When she asked the nurse, she was told that Dr. Martinez had decided to wait until morning to review them together. That evening, as Sarah tried to process the day's confusing events, her sister Emma arrived from Portland. Oh, Sarah, Emma cried, rushing to embrace her. I got here as fast as I could. How are you feeling? Confused, Sarah admitted. Everyone keeps telling me I'm sicker than I feel. Emma pulled back to study her sister's face. You look tired, but you don't look sick. What exactly are the doctors saying? Sarah explained about the blood pressure concerns and memory issues. As she talked, she watched Emma's expression grow increasingly troubled. Sarah, I've been a paramedic for 8 years. I know what severe preeclampsia looks like, and you don't have it. Not anymore. That's what I think too, but James and Dr. Martinez seem convinced that I'm not thinking clearly. Emma's frown deepened. Where is James now? He went to dinner with Cassie, something about finalizing the IPO presentation. On the day his twins were born? Emma's voice was sharp with disbelief. Sarah felt a stab of hurt that she had been trying to ignore. He's been under a lot of pressure with the company going public. Sarah, listen to me carefully, Emma said, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. Something doesn't feel right about this situation. That woman, Cassie, she's been way too involved in medical decisions that should be between you and James. I know, Sarah whispered, but James trusts her completely. If I say anything negative about her, he acts like I'm being irrational. Emma was quiet for a long moment. I think we need to get a second opinion on your medical condition, and I think we need to do it without James or Cassie knowing. That night after Emma left, Sarah lay awake thinking about her sister's words. She thought about the earring, the late-night text messages, Cassie's unusual knowledge of medical procedures, and James's increasingly distant behavior. But mostly she thought about the look in Cassie's eyes when she talked about the twins. It wasn't the fond concern of a family friend. It was something else entirely. Something that looked disturbingly like ownership. The second opinion came from Dr. Elena Vasquez, Emma's former supervisor at Portland General, who reviewed Sarah's medical records as a personal favor. Her assessment was delivered via a secure phone call that Emma took in the hospital parking garage. There's absolutely nothing in these records to justify extended hospitalization, Dr. Vasquez told Emma bluntly. Sarah's blood pressure normalized 48 hours post-delivery. Her lab values are completely normal. If I were treating her, I would have discharged her yesterday. Emma felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. So why would her doctor be telling her otherwise? I can't speculate about another physician's motives, but I can tell you that keeping a healthy patient hospitalized against medical necessity is grounds for review by the medical board. Armed with this information, Emma marched back into the hospital determined to get answers. She found Sarah in the NICU, sitting beside the twins' incubators with tears streaming down her face. What's wrong? Emma demanded, rushing to her sister's side. They won't let me hold them, Sarah sobbed. Dr. Martinez says my blood pressure is too unstable. that the stress of skin-to-skin contact could be dangerous for me and the babies. Emma's anger flared. That's complete nonsense. Skin-to-skin contact actually helps stabilize blood pressure and heart rate. That's what I thought too, but everyone keeps telling me I'm confused. James agreed with Dr. Martinez. He said we need to follow medical advice, even if it feels wrong. Emma looked around the NICU and spotted Cassie standing near the nurse's station, engaged in what appeared to be a very friendly conversation with the head nurse. As Emma watched, Cassie handed the nurse an envelope that looked suspiciously like a generous tip or donation. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," Emma said urgently. "I had Dr. Vasquez review your medical records. According to an independent expert, there is no medical reason for you to still be in this hospital." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone is lying to you about your condition, and I have a pretty good idea who." Before Sarah could respond, James appeared beside them, Cassie close behind. "What's going on here?" James asked, noticing Sarah's tears. "I was just telling Sarah about my conversation with Dr. Vasquez," Emma said defiantly. James's expression darkened. "You went behind our backs to get medical opinions from someone who hasn't even examined Sarah? Someone who doesn't have a vested interest in keeping her here?" Emma shot back. "What's that supposed to mean?" Cassie interjected, her voice perfectly modulated to sound shocked and hurt. Emma turned to face her directly. "It means I think you've been manipulating this entire situation from the beginning." The accusation hung in the air like a live wire. Sarah watched the faces around her, seeing James's anger, Cassie's wounded innocence, and Emma's fierce protectiveness. "Emma, that's enough," James said coldly. "I think you should leave." "I'm not going anywhere without my sister." "Your sister is exactly where she needs to be," Cassie said softly, "under medical supervision, with people who care about her and the baby's well-being." "People like you." Emma's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Yes, like me," Cassie replied, moving closer to James in a gesture that looked both protective and possessive. "I've been here every day, making sure Sarah has everything she needs while James handles the business responsibilities that support this family." Sarah watched this exchange with growing horror. She could see the way Cassie positioned herself as the reasonable, supportive partner, while Emma was painted as the hysterical, interfering sister. Worse, she could see that James was buying it completely. "Maybe Emma should take some time to cool off," James suggested, his arm moving almost automatically around Cassie's shoulders. The gesture was so casual, so natural, that Sarah knew immediately it wasn't the first time. These two people were comfortable touching each other in a way that spoke of intimacy beyond business partnership. "James," Sarah said quietly, "how long have you been sleeping with her?" The question dropped into the conversation like a bomb. James's face went white, then red. Cassie's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something calculating and cold. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous," James stammered. "The medication is making you paranoid." "Am I?" Sarah's voice was gaining strength. "Because right now you're standing there with your arm around another woman while your wife sits in a hospital bed and you're acting like it's perfectly normal." James dropped his arm as if Cassie had suddenly caught fire. "It's not what you think." "Not then what is it?" Sarah demanded. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Emma moved closer to Sarah's wheelchair, presenting a united front against whatever was about to be revealed. Finally, Cassie spoke. "Sarah, I think you're under a lot of stress right now. The premature birth, the hormones, the medication, it's all affecting your judgment. You're seeing threats where there aren't any." "The only threat I see is you," Sarah replied steadily. Cassie's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and for a moment Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. It was the look of someone who had been playing a long game and was getting tired of pretending. "I think," Cassie said carefully, "that we need to discuss what's best for everyone involved, including the babies." The way she said it, with a subtle emphasis on everyone, sounded distinctly like a threat. Sarah looked at James, searching his face for any sign that he understood what was happening, but his expression was closed off, protective of Cassie rather than his wife. That night, after Emma reluctantly left and James went home, Sarah lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling. She could feel everything she had built her life around crumbling beneath her, but she still couldn't see the full scope of what she was up against. She wouldn't understand the true depth of Cassie's plan until it was almost too late. 2 days later, Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital, but the victory felt hollow. The twins would remain in the NICU for at least another month, and Sarah's visits were now restricted to specific hours due to what Dr. Martinez called infection control protocols. It was a policy that somehow didn't apply to Cassie, who continued to visit freely as James's designated business associate. Back in the penthouse apartment she shared with James, Sarah felt like a stranger in her own home. The nursery they had carefully planned together had been completely redesigned during her hospital stay. The soft pastels and whimsical animal themes she had chosen were gone, replaced by a stark, modern aesthetic in grays and whites that looked more like a high-end showroom than a space for babies. Cassie thought the original design might be too stimulating for premature infants, James explained when Sarah questioned the changes. She consulted with some experts on infant development. "I would have liked to be consulted too," Sarah said quietly. "They're my babies." "Our babies," James corrected. "And you were in the hospital. Decisions had to be made." Sarah walked through the apartment, cataloging the other changes. Fresh flowers appeared daily, but they were expensive arrangements that looked professional rather than personal. The refrigerator was stocked with organic, artisanal foods that Sarah had never purchased. Even the coffee had been upgraded to a blend that Sarah didn't recognize. "Cassie's been helping with the household management," James explained when Sarah mentioned the changes. "She thought you'd appreciate coming home to everything being organized." It was thoughtful and invasive and completely characteristic of how Cassie operated, always just helpful enough that objecting would seem ungrateful. That evening, as Sarah sat in the redesigned nursery trying to feel some connection to the space where her children would eventually sleep, she heard James on the phone in his office. The conversation was muffled, but she caught fragments that made her stomach clench. "She's getting suspicious," James was saying. "Maybe we moved too fast with some things." A pause then. "I know you're trying to help, but Sarah's not stupid. She's starting to ask questions I can't answer." Another pause, longer this time. "No, I don't think she knows for sure, but Emma is pushing her to dig deeper." Sarah crept closer to the office door, her heart pounding. "What do you mean, handle Emma?" James's voice had taken on a sharp edge. "Cassie, we agreed to keep this simple." Sarah pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more, but James's voice dropped too low to make out the words. When the conversation ended a few minutes later, Sarah hurried back to the nursery, her mind racing. "Handle Emma? Keep what's simple?" The fragments of conversation painted a picture that Sarah didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find James already gone and a note on the kitchen counter. "Emergency investor meeting. Cassie will drive you to the hospital for your visit with the twins. Jay." Sarah crumpled the note, fury rising in her chest. She was perfectly capable of driving herself to see her own children. The fact that James had arranged for Cassie to escort her felt like another small erosion of her autonomy. But when Cassie arrived, she was carrying 2 coffee cups and wearing an expression of genuine warmth that caught Sarah off guard. "I thought you might want some of that lavender honey latte from the place near the hospital," Cassie said, offering Sarah one of the cups. "I know how much you've been craving decent coffee." It was exactly the drink Sarah had been wanting, and she found herself touched by the gesture, despite her suspicions. "Thank you. That's really thoughtful." During the drive to the hospital, Cassie was the perfect companion, sympathetic about the stress of having babies in the NICU, knowledgeable about the latest research on premature infant development, and full of encouraging stories about preemies who had thrived. "I've been doing a lot of reading," Cassie explained as they walked through the hospital corridors. "I want to be as helpful as possible during this difficult time." Sarah felt her guard dropping slightly. Maybe she had been too quick to judge. Maybe the stress of the situation was making her paranoid about someone who was genuinely trying to help. That feeling lasted until they reached the NICU. Sarah's usual routine was to check in with the nurses about the twins' overnight progress, then settle in for several hours of talking to them, reading aloud, and providing pumped breast milk. But today, when she approached Oliver's incubator, she found a woman she didn't recognize sitting in the chair beside it. The woman was young, probably in her 20s, wearing scrubs that identified her as a NICU nurse. She was holding a bottle and feeding Oliver with a competence that spoke of experience. Excuse me, Sarah said politely. I'm Oliver's mother. Is there a reason he's being bottle-fed instead of receiving breast milk? The nurse looked up with surprise that seemed genuine. Oh, Mrs. Richardson. I'm sorry, I was told you wouldn't be in until this afternoon. Ms. Wells brought the bottles this morning and said you had approved the supplementation. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. Ms. Wells brought bottles? Yes, she's been very involved in the feeding schedule. She explained that your milk production had been insufficient and that you wanted to try a high-calorie formula to help the babies gain weight faster. Sarah turned to look at Cassie, who was standing behind her with an expression of helpful concern. I thought we discussed this yesterday, Cassie said smoothly. You were worried about your milk supply, and I researched the best options for supplementation. We never discussed that, Sarah said slowly, and my milk supply is fine. The nurse looked between them uncertainly. I can check the chart for the authorization. That won't be necessary, Cassie said quickly. I think there's just been some confusion about timing. Why don't we let Sarah take over the feeding now? But when Sarah reached for the bottle, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The lavender honey latte, she realized with growing horror. Cassie had drugged her coffee with something that was making her dizzy and disoriented. Sarah, are you feeling all right? Cassie asked with perfect concern. You look pale. I'm fine, Sarah managed, but her voice sounded slurred even to her own ears. Maybe you should sit down, the nurse suggested, moving towards Sarah with professional alarm. You don't look well. Sarah wanted to explain what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. The room was spinning, and she could feel herself losing the ability to think clearly. I think we should call Dr. Martinez, Cassie said, already reaching for her phone. Sarah's been having episodes like this since the birth. The doctors are concerned about postpartum complications. As Sarah felt consciousness slipping away, she heard Cassie speaking to someone on the phone. Yes, she's disoriented again, confused about conversations we've had, making accusations that don't make sense. I think she needs to be readmitted for evaluation. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went black was Cassie's face leaning over her, and the expression on it was no longer helpful or concerned. It was victorious. Sarah woke up in a psychiatric evaluation room at Seattle General, restrained to the bed with soft cuffs that nonetheless made escape impossible. The walls were beige and featureless except for a single window with reinforced glass. A camera in the corner tracked her every movement. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the psychiatrist on duty, sat in a chair just out of Sarah's reach, reviewing a thick file that Sarah realized with growing horror was about her. Mrs. Richardson, I'm Dr. Chen. How are you feeling? Confused, Sarah said honestly. Why am I here? Where are my babies? You're here because you had another episode of disorientation and paranoid thinking. Your husband and Miss Wells brought you in after you became agitated at the hospital and made threatening statements toward the nursing staff. Sarah's blood ran cold. I never threatened anyone. I was drugged. Cassie put something in my coffee. Dr. Chen made a note in the file. Can you tell me about your relationship with Miss Wells? She's trying to steal my life, Sarah said, then immediately regretted how crazy it sounded. In what way? Sarah took a breath, trying to organize her thoughts despite the fog that still clouded her mind. She's having an affair with my husband. She's been manipulating my medical care to keep me away from my children. She's been feeding my babies without my consent and telling the staff that I'm mentally unstable. These are serious accusations, Dr. Chen said neutrally. What evidence do you have to support them? I heard James on the phone talking about handling my sister Emma. I saw them touching each other intimately. I found Cassie's earring in my house before I was even hospitalized. As Sarah spoke, she could see Dr. Chen's expression becoming more concerned, but not concerned for Sarah's safety, concerned about Sarah's mental state. Mrs. Richardson, according to your medical records, you've been experiencing increasing paranoia and confusion since your children's premature birth. This is consistent with postpartum psychosis, a serious but treatable condition. I don't have postpartum psychosis, Sarah said desperately. I have a husband who's having an affair and a woman who's trying to take my children. Your husband seems very concerned about you. He's been here every day during your previous admissions, and he's provided detailed accounts of your increasingly erratic behavior at home. Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Every genuine concern she had raised had been reframed as evidence of mental illness. Every attempt to protect herself and her children was being used as proof that she was unfit to care for them. "Where is James now?" Sarah asked. "He's meeting with social services about temporary custody arrangements for the twins while you receive treatment." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Temporary custody? They're my children. "Mrs. Richardson, your children are premature infants who require specialized care. Given your current mental state, the priority has to be their safety and well-being." "I would never hurt my children," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I believe that," Dr. Chen said gently. "But your perception of reality has been compromised. You need treatment before you can safely care for infants." The door opened and James walked in, his face a mask of concerned sadness that Sarah now recognized as completely artificial. "How is she?" he asked Dr. Chen. Still experiencing paranoid delusions, but she's responsive to questioning." James approached the bed cautiously, as if Sarah might attack him. "Sarah, sweetheart, I need you to understand that we're all trying to help you." "Where are Oliver and Emma?" Sarah demanded. "They're safe. They're being well cared for." "By whom?" James exchanged a glance with Dr. Chen. "The hospital staff, and Cassie has been helping coordinate their care while I handle the legal arrangements." "Legal arrangements?" "For their guardianship while you're in treatment. It's temporary, just until you're better." Sarah understood now. This was the endgame. Cassie had maneuvered James into a position where he would willingly sign over custody of his own children to protect them from their supposedly unstable mother. And once that happened, Sarah would have no legal standing to fight for them. "James, please listen to me," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain calm and rational. "I know how this looks, but Cassie has been drugging me. She's been manipulating both of us. If you sign custody papers, you'll never get the children back." "Sarah, you're sick," James said sadly. "Cassie has been nothing but supportive through this entire crisis. She's sacrificed her own time and energy to help our family." "She's been planning this from the beginning," Sarah insisted. "The affair, getting close to you, learning about my medical history, positioning herself as the responsible alternative when I was painted as unstable." James's expression hardened. "Enough. I can't listen to these delusions anymore." He turned to Dr. Chen. "What's the timeline for treatment?" "With medication and therapy, we typically see improvement in 4 to 6 weeks. However, given the severity of her symptoms and the presence of newborn infants, I would recommend a longer observation period to ensure stability." "Whatever it takes," James said firmly. "I won't risk my children's safety." As James left the room, Sarah called after him desperately. "James, please, just ask yourself one question. Who benefits if I'm declared mentally incompetent?" But he was already gone, and Sarah was alone with the crushing realization that Cassie had won completely. She had James's trust, legal access to the children, and Sarah safely locked away as a diagnosed mental patient whose word would never be believed against hers. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt true despair. She had lost everything, and worse, she had lost it to someone who had planned every move with ruthless precision. 3 weeks into Sarah's involuntary psychiatric hold, Emma made a discovery that would change everything. Emma had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth, hiring a private investigator named Marcus Torres and digging into Cassie Wells's background with the determination of someone who knew her sister was in danger. What she found was more disturbing than even Sarah's worst fears. Cassandra Wells didn't exist before 5 years ago. The woman who had inserted herself into James's business and personal life was actually Catherine Walsh, a former pharmaceutical sales representative who had been fired from 3 different companies for falsifying medical credentials. Before that, she had been Carol Winters, who had been investigated but never charged in connection with the sudden death of an elderly patient whose will she had influenced him to change in her favor. But the most shocking discovery came when Emma traced the medical care Sarah had received during her hospital stay. Dr. Martinez, the physician who had insisted on keeping Sarah hospitalized despite her improving condition, had received a substantial donation to his research fund from a shell company that Emma's investigator traced back to Cassie. The psychiatric evaluation that had landed Sarah in involuntary commitment had been requested by Cassie, not James, using forged documentation that suggested she had medical power of attorney. Armed with this information, Emma contacted the one person she thought might help, Dr. Maya Patel, Sarah's former supervisor from her nursing days, who now worked as a patient advocate specializing in medical abuse cases. Dr. Patel reviewed the evidence with growing alarm. "This is systematic medical manipulation," she told Emma during a late-night meeting in her office. "If what you're telling me is true, your sister has been the victim of an elaborate scheme to declare her mentally incompetent and steal her children." "Can we prove it?" Emma asked. "The falsified medical records alone are grounds for criminal charges. But we need to move fast. If James signs permanent custody papers, it becomes much harder to reverse." The next morning, Dr. Patel arranged for an independent psychiatric evaluation of Sarah by Dr. Jonathan Reed, a forensic psychiatrist with experience in cases involving medical manipulation. Dr. Reed's examination was thorough and revealing. "Mrs. Richardson shows no signs of postpartum psychosis or any other psychiatric disorder," he reported to Dr. Patel and Emma. "Her accounts of events are consistent, detailed, and rational. The symptoms documented in her previous evaluations are consistent with someone who has been administered psychoactive drugs without consent." Blood tests confirmed the presence of benzodiazepines and other sedatives in Sarah's system, drugs that had never been prescribed for her postpartum care. But even with this evidence, getting Sarah released required navigating a complex legal system that was biased toward protecting medical professionals and existing custody arrangements. Emma filed emergency motions and contacted the state medical board. But bureaucracy moved slowly while Cassie moved quickly. On a Friday afternoon, Emma received a call that sent her into a panic. James had filed papers to formally adopt the twins as a single parent, claiming that Sarah had abandoned them by refusing treatment for her mental illness. Cassie was listed as the proposed caregiver and co-guardian. "They're moving the adoption hearing to Monday," Emma told Dr. Patel frantically. "If this goes through, Sarah will lose all parental rights." "Then we need to get her out of there this weekend," Dr. Patel said grimly. The plan they developed was risky but necessary. Dr. Patel used her credentials to request a medical transfer of Sarah to an outside facility for specialized testing. During the transfer, which would take place on Sunday morning, Sarah would instead be taken to Dr. Reed's office for documentation of her actual mental state and preparation for Monday's custody hearing. Emma spent Saturday night preparing Sarah for what might be their only chance to save her family. "You need to understand," Emma told her sister during visiting hours, speaking in code they had developed as children. "The snow is melting on Monday morning." Sarah understood. Emma had found a way to get her out, and they had one chance to expose Cassie before it was too late. But as Emma left the psychiatric facility that night, she didn't notice the figure watching from a car in the parking lot. Cassie had been monitoring Emma's visits, and she had her own plans for Monday morning. Plans that would require Sarah to never make it to the custody hearing at all. The game was entering its final phase, and Cassie was prepared to do whatever it took to win. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for what she hoped would be her escape from the psychiatric facility. The medical transfer was scheduled for 9 a.m., and Emma had managed to communicate that Dr. Reed would be waiting instead of the transport team. But at 8:30, Dr. Chen appeared at Sarah's door with an unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Richardson, your husband is here to see you before your transfer." James walked into the room looking haggard and uncertain, nothing like the confident businessman who had dismissed Sarah's concerns weeks earlier. Behind him, inevitably, was Cassie, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that made her look like she was dressed for a funeral. "Sarah," James began, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine emotion, "I wanted to see you before the hearing tomorrow." "What hearing?" Sarah asked carefully, not wanting to reveal that Emma had already told her about the adoption proceedings. "The custody hearing. I filed for sole custody of the twins while you receive treatment." "With Cassie as co-guardian, I assume?" James flinched at the bitterness in her voice. "She's been incredible through all of this, Sarah. She's been taking care of them when I can't be there." "How convenient for her," Sarah said, watching Cassie's face for any reaction. For just a moment, Cassie's mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating. But it was gone so quickly that Sarah wondered if James had noticed it at all. "I know you think I'm sick," Sarah continued, But I need you to answer one question honestly. Do you love her? The question hung in the air between them. James looked at Cassie, then back at Sarah, and for the first time in weeks, his expression was completely open. I think I do, he admitted quietly. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for this to happen. And when did it start? Sarah pressed. Before or after you found out I was pregnant? Does it matter? Cassie interjected smoothly. The important thing is what's best for the children now. It matters to me, Sarah said, her eyes never leaving James's face. James was quiet for a long moment. It started about 6 months ago. When we found out about the twins, I panicked. The responsibility felt overwhelming, and Cassie was there to help me think through everything. Help you think through what, exactly? Whether I was ready to be a father, whether our marriage was strong enough to handle the stress, whether you and I wanted the same things for our future. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. And what conclusion did you reach? That maybe we got married too quickly, James said painfully. That maybe we weren't as compatible as we thought. Cassie moved closer to James, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture of support that looked natural and practiced. James has been struggling with these feelings for months, Cassie said gently. The pregnancy crisis just forced him to confront some difficult truths about your relationship. Sarah stared at them, seeing clearly for the first time how masterfully Cassie had manipulated the situation. She had taken James's normal anxiety about becoming a father and transformed it into doubt about his marriage. She had positioned herself as the wise counselor, helping him work through his feelings, all while systematically undermining his wife. You planned this from the beginning, Sarah said to Cassie. The affair was just the first step. Sarah, you're being paranoid again, James said tiredly. Am I? Sarah stood up from the bed, feeling strength returning to her voice. Let me tell you what I think happened. Cassie seduced you when she found out I was pregnant because she saw an opportunity. A tech billionaire with newborn twins and a conveniently unstable wife who could be painted as mentally ill and removed from the picture. That's enough, Cassie said sharply, her composure finally cracking. She's been drugging me, James. She's been bribing medical staff. She's been manipulating my care to make me seem unstable while positioning herself as the responsible alternative. You're delusional, Cassie snapped, then seemed to realize how harsh she sounded. I'm sorry, but this is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking the doctors are concerned about. Sarah smiled grimly. Then you won't mind if we test that theory. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small recording device that Emma had smuggled to her during yesterday's visit. Sarah, what are you doing? James asked nervously. Playing back a conversation I recorded 3 days ago, Sarah said, pressing play. Cassie's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The psychiatric hold has to be extended through the custody hearing. If she's released before then, she might convince James to change his mind. I've already talked to Dr. Chen about adjusting her medication to ensure she remains symptomatic. The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at the recording device as if it might bite him. There's more, Sarah said quietly. Would you like to hear the part where she discusses how much money she'll have access to once the adoption is finalized? Or the part where she talks about selling the twins to her contacts in international adoption if you become inconvenient? James's face had gone completely white. That's not possible. Play it, Cassie said desperately. Let him hear the full context. You're twisting my words. But Sarah could see in James's eyes that he was finally seeing the truth. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had trusted with his children, was a predator who had been playing a long game with his family as the prize. Security is going to be here any minute, Sarah said calmly. Emma called them 20 minutes ago with evidence of medical fraud, falsified documents, and attempted kidnapping. The question is whether you're going to stand with your wife and children or with the woman who's been destroying our family for months. James looked at Cassie one last time, searching her face for some explanation that would make sense of everything he had just heard. What he saw there was pure, undisguised hatred. You stupid, weak man, Cassie snarled. You have no idea what you're throwing away. And with that, the mask came off completely, revealing the monster that had been hiding underneath. The sound of security guards and police officers entering the psychiatric facility echoed down the hallway as Cassie's carefully constructed world collapsed around her. Emma burst through the door moments later, followed by Dr. Patel and a King County detective who had been investigating Cassie's background. Catherine Walsh, Detective Rivera said, reading from an arrest warrant, "You're under arrest for medical fraud, identity theft, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping." Cassie's transformation was complete. Gone was the polished, helpful businesswoman who had charmed her way into the Richardson family. In her place stood a woman whose eyes burned with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she hissed at Sarah as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I've done this before, and I'll do it again. You can't protect them forever." "Actually, I think I can," Sarah replied calmly, "because now everyone knows who you really are." As Cassie was led away, still screaming threats and profanities, Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway looking shaken and confused. "Mrs. Richardson, I owe you an enormous apology," she said. "Dr. Martinez and I have been reviewing your real medical records with the independent experts Dr. Patel brought in. It's clear that your care has been compromised from the beginning." Sarah felt a wave of vindication so strong it almost brought her to her knees. "What happens now?" "Now you go home to your children," Emma said, wrapping her sister in a fierce hug. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Dr. Martinez lost his medical license and faced criminal charges for accepting bribes and falsifying medical records. The psychiatric hold was immediately lifted, and all of Cassie's actions on behalf of the Richardson family were declared legally void. But the most important moment came when Sarah was finally reunited with Oliver and Emma in the NICU. They had grown during her forced absence, becoming stronger and more alert, but they still recognized her voice immediately. "They knew you were their mother," the head nurse told Sarah as she finally held her son and daughter properly for the first time. "Every time that woman tried to feed them or interact with them, they would cry, but they're calm with you." James stood beside the incubators looking lost and ashamed. "Sarah, I don't know how to apologize for what I've done." "You don't," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from Emma's tiny face. "You just do better from now on. Can you forgive me?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, considering the question. "I don't know yet, but I'm willing to try, for their sake." It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. James moved into the guest room while they worked through months of couples therapy. Sarah struggled with trust issues and PTSD from her ordeal, but slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild their family on a foundation of honesty and genuine communication. The twins thrived. Oliver grew into a confident toddler who reminded Sarah of James at his best. Emma became a quiet observer who seemed to understand everything around her with startling clarity. 6 months after Cassie's arrest, Sarah started a nonprofit organization called Medical Truth, dedicated to helping patients who had been victims of medical manipulation and fraud. The organization's first major case involved exposing a network of corrupt doctors and fake patient advocates who had been systematically defrauding elderly patients. "Every victory for justice makes the world a little safer," Sarah told a reporter during an interview about the organization's work. "And sometimes the people who hurt us end up teaching us how to protect others." James threw himself into supporting the organization, using his business connections and resources to expand its reach. It became a way for him to atone for his failures and to honor the strength Sarah had shown during their darkest time. As for Cassie, she was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after additional victims came forward. The investigation revealed that she had been running variations of the same scheme for over a decade, targeting wealthy men with young children and vulnerable wives. On a sunny afternoon 2 years after her arrest, Sarah was working in her garden while the twins played nearby when Emma called with news. "She's appealing her sentence," Emma told her. "Her lawyers are claiming she was mentally ill and not responsible for her actions." Sarah watched Oliver chase butterflies while Emma sat in her stroller, babbling happily to herself. "Let her appeal," Sarah said peacefully. "The truth doesn't change just because someone wants to deny it." And that, Sarah reflected as she ended the call and returned to her garden, was the most important lesson she had learned through her ordeal. The truth had power, even when it was buried under lies and manipulation. Sometimes it took time to emerge, and sometimes good people made terrible mistakes while searching for it. But in the end, the truth always found a way to the surface. As Oliver ran to her with a handful of dandelions and Emma clapped her hands in delight, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of a mother who had fought for her children and won. Not just against Cassie, but against the systems and people who had tried to convince her that her own perceptions couldn't be trusted. She had learned to trust herself again, and that was perhaps the greatest victory of all.